Hello, welcome. This is Xenia. I'm Tom. We're here to tell you about how we could use AI to free players' agency from the limits of predefined language. We're both from the University of Klagenfurt in Austria, and we're graduates of the Game Studies and Engineering program. We just graduated recently, and we plan on doing our PhDs in this field soon as well. So this is just more or less a passion project of ours, but we hope that we can actually use it in our PhD research. A little bit more about the study program. So GSE, which is short for Game Studies and Engineering, is an interdisciplinary study program. And here at the University of Klagenfurt, we're also co-hosting the Video Games Cultures Conference. And we also have our own student journal, the so-called Playwright Student Journal. To start with, we have a nice quote from good old Wittgenstein, who said, "Limits of my language mean the limits of my world." So what is meant here is that everything is already limited by the language that you know of, but in games this applies even further, because designers and developers have to decide on which language they allow players to use, especially when making decisions. So you are quite limited in your agency in that way. And just to show that how relevant all of this still is, this is a news headline just from this week, where a new studio has been funded with more than $3 million, which will harness the power of AI to empower previously impossible levels of player agency.
So I will talk briefly now about our agenda for today. So after our introduction, we will talk a little bit about emergent storytelling and gameplay, both in tabletop role-playing games and in video games. Then we will move on to the definition of player agency and predefined choices in games, as well as some well-known examples. And then we will give also a definition and some basic concepts from generative AI. And then we will move on to our main topic for today, which is AI-assisted player agency, where we will talk about state-of-the-art research and as well as our own research and our initial prototypes. So, and we will conclude with talking about potential dangers and ethical implications of using generative AI in video games. So here are two main research questions that we will explore throughout our presentation. First is can the integration of generative artificial intelligence in video game design enhance players' agency? And second, what are the implications for player experience and emergent storytelling?
That's already an important keyword, emergent storytelling, which is basically the idea that a story emerges from playing a game that was not originally thought of by the developers or designers of said game. And of course, the original emergent storytelling can kind of be seen in pen and paper role-playing games, where you had a dungeon master who would collaborate together with the players to tell a story that has not been written before. And the dungeon master had to interact and dynamically adjust the story and what was happening in the game to whatever the players were doing. So it was never really sure what was happening in the future. However, as soon as those pen and paper role-playing games were translated to video games, the designers and developers had to predict what players would want to do, and they had to anticipate what choices they would want to make, and also what language they would want to use when making certain choices or interacting with certain characters. And this, of course, limits very much what you can do in such a scenario.
So a little bit about emergent storytelling and gameplay in video games. But I also wanted to mention what I find fascinating about D&D and emergent storytelling is how there are a set of predefined rules, there is a world. However, via interaction of dungeon master, game master, and players, the emergent storytelling comes out via their interaction and their creative input, which I find the most fascinating about it. And one of the motivations behind this research is that can we propose these ideas into the video games via language learning models. And a little bit about existing emergent storytelling and gameplay in video games. So on the left we can see Sims, which is a quite famous example of emergent storytelling, where Sims are agents in the game world that have limited decision-making possibilities, where they act based on their needs that they have, basic needs, as well as their goals and ambitions set up either by the player or randomly by the game world. Even though this produces some sort of emergent storytelling, I believe it is still quite limited, since you run into the same kind of interactions and the same behavior of Sims again and again. And so this is a little bit about emergent gameplay. So games, immersive Sims like Deus Ex and Dishonored, and partially Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, and Breath of the Wild offer players to utilize their agency to interact with the game world to achieve the game's goals via different means. So how you can see in this example from Legend of Zelda, Link can use his abilities in different ways to construct a car or a plane or etc. to reach his stated goals for a quest.
So we've been talking a lot about player agency already. I want to give you a brief definition. All of you who have been in touch with game studies probably already heard a lot about it and how difficult it is to define. However, here is a somewhat recent definition by Carsten Dotter et al. From 2021, and they said that agency in games can be described as the phenomenon where a player feels that the actions presented to them in the context of the game are meaningful, and that their choice of action has a meaningful impact on the context or the game world in which they reside. So the general idea is, of course, that players can do within the game what they actually want to do, so what their intentions are, and that those are reflected by the game, and that it also has a meaningful impact on the game world. The problem with this definition, of course, in the context of video games, is that video games are often seen as engines of experiences, as Sylvester said in 2013 in his famous book Designing Games, A Guide to Engineering Experiences. Many people think that video games are designed in a specific way by the developers and designers to allow players to have a very certain specific experience. And if you want them to have this experience, you of course have to railroad them into them sometimes. This is of course the very opposite of what agency would mean, because you have to derive players of the agency to give them these certain experiences. So these two things are kind of at cross, and we want to explore how we could maybe use large language models and other forms of AI to still give players this agency, but also allowing them to have a certain designed experience. Here are some examples of predefined choices in games. Like, for example, on the right, you can see in Mass Effect 1, famously binary choices between blue and red, basically good and evil, and you don't really have much options to choose anything in between or to elaborate on why you choose something. So if we would allow players to actually input what they want to say via text or via speech, things like this could be reduced. On the other hand, you also have interactions with characters like NPCs or party members, which always come down to, at some point, those characters have nothing left to say to you and they just repeat the last line over and over again. And this could also be removed by using AI. For example, Gareth here on the left, who always just talks about calibrations once you are done talking with him enough times.
And here's maybe a more serious example, and games like Life is Strange that are more story and narrative driven and rely heavily on making certain choices. And in episode 2 of the game, a player is faced with a situation where they can prevent someone from taking their life or not. So, and the choices of dialogues that you have are not obvious in what you're supposed to choose, or in my personal opinion, they're not obvious. And quite limiting, and this puts all of the responsibility on the player to understand the intent of the designers of what choices they're supposed to take in order to prevent someone from taking their life, which is quite a lot of responsibility to put on a player. And also, if you don't manage as a player, it's quite a lot of guilt then is put on you for not accomplishing this, which I believe is quite harmful, actually. And and I believe using large language models, we could help mitigate situations like that, not even talking whether we should include situations like that in games in the first place, of course. And this is also another example of a story-driven game, The Walking Dead by Telltale, which was first in its genre of, I would say, Telltale games. What was very unique and novel about these games is when it first came out, we could feel that the players' choices impacted the game, especially by these notes that we could see on the screen, like Clementine will remember that, etc. And however, the games in the end faced a lot of criticism for, even though the game made known explicitly that your choices are matter a lot, then in the end they all ended up converging into the same storyline, and most of your choices ended up influencing how characters perceive you, or if they're happy with you or unhappy with you. And in the end, it turns out that your actions are quite limited, I would personally say.
Yeah, and the effect on the story was almost nothing, right?
Yes. RIP Telltale. Sorry. So here we just give a general introduction to generative AI and a definition. So generative AI refers to a class of artificial intelligence system designed to generate new and unique content such as images, text, or other data based on patterns and knowledge learned from existing examples. So generative AI is already being used in games in various aspects, such as generating of textures and assets, level design generation, narrative generation, dynamic dialogue systems, procedural content generation, etc. And here we will see in the next slide some examples. So on the left, we can see a roguelike game Spelunky, which uses procedural content generation for level design. So each new game is unique because of the generated levels. And on the right, we can see Minecraft, and Minecraft also uses procedural content generation to generate environments and to make an endlessly open world. And in the middle, we can see Left 4 Dead, which uses an AI system called the Director, which influences spawning of items, swarms of enemies, enemy behavior towards the player, etc. And the specific AI models that we are talking about today are large language models, which are AI systems specifically focused on understanding and generating human-like text. They are trained on extensive data sets to comprehend language nuances and produce coherent and contextually relevant textual content. So how do we use large language models or LLMs in games?
That's the question.
So briefly, some of the possibilities how LLMs can be used. So to enhance and diversify dynamic dialogue systems for natural language input as AI-generated companions, which Tom will talk about in a bit, to receive personalized feedback on players' actions and decisions, and maybe even gameplay style, and as possibility for content moderation in online multiplayer games, for example. And of course, what we are most interested in how LLMs can be used in emerging narratives and for enhancing player agency.
Exactly. Natural language input here, as far as I understand, refers to, for example, instead of choosing between option A and B, you enter the text or even you speak into the microphone saying what you want to do, right?
Exactly.
So here's an example of a game that we developed during a game jam together with our friend Rachel Gordon. And this game gives the player 2 randomly assigned quests, and then they have to design and create a character, giving them a name, an outfit, and a special ability, as well as a setting, and see how they fare out. And the story is generated by an LLM, more specifically Chat-GPT. And in addition to the story, which can be seen here, for example, you get basically one for each quest. You also get an image generated by DALL-E, which is the OpenAI image creation solution, which shows you how your character does on this quest. And so there's multiple examples. For example, here you can see a drag queen coding a tic-tac-toe game. Another state-of-the-art example is the infamous AI dungeon, which can be played for free in the browser. It originally came out in 2019, but it has been updated a lot and nowadays already uses GPT-3 as well. And in this game, you can basically choose your setting and then input via text whatever you want to do. And the game acts as a sort of dungeon master, similar to Matthew Mercer, who we saw in one of the first slides, and reacts to what you want to do and allows you to do this in the game world. There's also some recent developments in case of modding existing games, like here, for example, you can see the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim and the companion Lydia, and people have already created modifications where they use the OpenAI API to allow Lydia basically to have access to ChatGPT, where you can input any sort of question to talk to her, and she will respond not only logically but also in character and knowing the state of the world that both of you inhabit. Here is a more research-based example, which is from a recently published master thesis, I think, where they created an merchant in a futuristic shop, and this merchant would respond dynamically to player inputs. Like, for example, here on the picture, you can see that the player asked for a helmet for their dog, and the merchant not only generated a name for it, the canine compatible neural interface helmet, but also used image generation software to generate an image and then sell it to the player.
So how can we use generative AI to help fix some of the shortcomings in player agency that we mentioned before? Here are some of our ideas. So firstly, I would like to talk about previously mentioned title games and narrative and story-driven games, and some ideas of how we can enhance players' agency in that regard. So firstly, natural language input possibility, like we mentioned before, via voice, or actually putting your decisions as an open text option. I believe also enhances accessibility, and accessibility in general for people with different cognitive abilities, and
also motor functions, and also processing inputs differently. Exactly.
Thank you. So also decision impact and flexibility. So feeling that your decisions are impactful as a player, and that also they are not final. So once you make a decision that and for example a character ends up being unhappy with you, then you can further talk to this character and try to come to an understanding and perhaps explain why you made a certain choice through a large language model. And more on that, beyond character reactions refers to feeling that your actions are not only impacting how other characters perceive you or view you, or their mood towards you. So if they're happy or unhappy with you, so making more meaningful and impactful decisions that are also empowering, and you as a player feel like they impact the world and the narrative around you. Furthermore, I believe it's also important to have agency not to make a decision, and since a lot of the times when you are given that option in games, and especially story-driven games like Telltale, once you don't make a decision, it is usually regarded as a negative thing, that you are indecisive or further makes characters around you unhappy with you. And I believe it's also would be beneficial for it to be okay to not be the player to be the sole decision maker. Yeah, okay. And furthermore, in story-driven and narrative games especially, I believe it's important to strike a balance between authored storytelling and AI assistant agency. And I believe it should be a collaboration, and AI should be more of a writing assistant, possibly to writers, and not in any way replace them. And this also brings us to making strategic constraints for emergent storytelling. So constraints, I believe, are very important in incorporating AI in games, especially story-driven games, to make sure that the emergent storytelling is still within the constraints of the game world, the context of the game, and the intentions of the writer and game designers. More on story-driven games are another genre that are very popular are visual novels and especially dating simulators, such as we can see, for example, here in Dream Daddy, a 2017 game. How LLMs can be used to enhance these types of games via agency is dynamic conversation systems, so making conversations more diverse and specific and context aware, and furthermore understanding player intent. Sometimes when you make a decision in these types of games, your intention is your intentions. The given choices do not reflect your intentions, and via large language models, your intent can be made more clear to the characters and elaborated on further. So another point that I would like to make refers to the term kindness coins, which is used to describe how in many games, for example, Hades or Mass Effect, you get characters or NPCs affection by giving them gifts, giving them attention, doing things for them. And this can be considered a problematic mechanic, since it's basically implying that you can buy someone's affection. And I think that introducing generative AI into these kind of relationships in games could be a viable alternative. Yes, and contribute to emergent relationships that have their own sense of development beyond just giving them gifts to the NPCs.
Because there's also important real-world implications of things like that. When players learn that all relationships are basically transactional, this can be very negative and have impacts on how they behave towards potential partners in the real world too.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, exactly. And I already mentioned on AI-driven character development. So characters can develop via your interactions with them and not just follow a pre-authored development arc, which I think is also an interesting point to consider. And furthermore, artists could also utilize image generators also as an assistant to help them produce more also dynamic images as they adapt to the decision making via large language models of players. And I believe this is also a very good opportunity for social skills learning, especially for a lot of people who require this skill or use or rely on games for social skills or emotional skills learning. And I think that would be a good opportunity for potential
to
learning.
learn such things.
Mhm. Yeah.
Also empathy, right? If we want to go a little bit ahead. Maybe.
Yeah.
So just some ideas that this would also include companion interactions. There is famous single-player game companions, like for example Elizabeth in Bioshock Infinite or Ellie in The Last of Us, who basically roam the world around you and look for ammo or items while you are traversing the levels. But with AI assistants, they could actually become more than that. You could give them commands on what exactly you want to do them to do, or you could converse with them, ask them about the situation and what they think. Many things like that would be possible because they would be aware of the context and the situation they would be in. It would also allow people like Garrus to talk more than just about calibrations after all of their possible dialogue options have been exhausted. So now we want to talk a little bit about a prototype that we created to allow player agency not only in the choices they make, but also in the character creator, because traditional character creators are oftentimes very limited, especially when it comes to representation of, for example, elderly people, disabled people, or any kind of non-normative things. We used Chat-GPT and DALL-E to basically create more diverse characters, and even though this is pixel art and very small in scope, in the future this will certainly be more extensive and also allow for high fidelity models to be used. And as can be seen here, it allows, for example, the use of elderly people, or also, for example, instead of having to choose and click through all of the options, you could just give a description of a real life person that you want to model your character after, and it would give you basically the image of this person to play as. In the prototype that we created, you can then use the character that you created to interact with NPCs as well via text conversation. For example, here you can see the Julius Caesar-like character conversing with Cleopatra, and she seems to be quite inclined to him, whereas when you approach her as an elderly, confused woman, she is actually a bit more reserved, especially a bit more guarded. And the reason for that is because we basically use ChatGPT here and tell it via a so-called system message what it is supposed to do. For example, it is supposed to play the character of Cleopatra. It is slightly annoyed. It doesn't trust the conversation partner at the start. It doesn't use too many sentences to respond. And it also gives them access to the description that you use to create your character, so they can react to that as well.
So in this slide, I would like to talk a little bit about constraints and limitation, particularly from a technical side of including large language models in video games. Firstly, it's resource intensiveness. So large language models and a lot of other models of generative AI require a lot of computational power, especially for real-time application. It can pose a lot of constraints on platforms and devices that are not suitable for this kind of high computational expense. Furthermore, contextual understanding. AI language models still can struggle with the context and understanding the ambiguous player input that within the game world and the player intent, and so this can result into suboptimal answers or suboptimal content from AI. Limited creativity. Large language models are trained to recognize certain patterns, which can lead to limited creativity. So this is also one of the potential dangers.
And even though it's supposed to be always different, right, it can also lead to always getting the same responses.
Yep. And training data limitations. Large language models heavily depend on the data that is used to train them. And if the training data is suboptimal, then it will result in a suboptimal large language model and henceforth gameplay and
experience for the
experience for the player. Thank you.
So there is a lot of criticism to be had, and you can also see in media, like in news outlets, how generative AI is overhyped and will go down, which is apparently what analysts predict. And also there's publishers like Humble Games, for example, who don't want developers to use AI, generative AI, in their games, usually because it's not clear what training data was used to have them trained. And thus there is also always the risk of copyright infringement included in this, because especially OpenAI's Chat-GPT and image generation models have become under a lot of scrutiny of using basically the entire internet as training data, which of course includes a lot of copyrighted material. There's also a lot of complaints from people in online forums, like here are 2 posts from Reddit, for example, complaining that this would suck out the human part of art in video games. They're not interested in infinite storylines. They are only interested in stories that are specifically created by humans. They don't want AI to do this. And those are valid criticisms and things to be thought about, but we will see in the future what will be brought by using such models in our video games. Here are just some more potential dangers and ethical implications that the use of AI in video games could bring about. So we already mentioned the training dataset can have copyrighted material. It can include biases. There's famous examples of training data only being harvested for white people, for example, and then as soon as a black person tries to use the same application that is trained on this training data, they do not get favorable or even any results. There's a big problem with power consumption as well. This is more in the training than in the actual application, as far as I understand, but the training consumes a lot of power, and we already have issues of sustainability and the climate crisis on our hands. So this is something to consider as well. So loss of jobs is also an often brought up point, and even though we believe that artists and writers will still always be necessary and might actually have more jobs in the future, voice actors might have a real concern there, because even nowadays there is already companies that let voice actors sign contracts which would allow the companies to use the voice lines they record as training data to then generate AI models, which would then completely replace the voice actors, which of course would mean they would lose their jobs. And this has to be regulated like on a governmental level, because just talking about the ethical things here is probably not enough when there is a profit incentive that drives those decisions. As mentioned on the previous slide, there's also oftentimes this complaint about the loss of a human element, and we think this is also a valid criticism, but at the same time, we don't want necessarily games to be completely written by AI. We want writers to basically set the stage, tell the stories, give the AI the input it needs, give it the training data it needs, and this human element will always still be there. Of course, there can also be games created only by AI, but this is not what we're talking about here. Then there is 3 more risks that we want to mention. The first one is the idea of breaking immersion. This is especially now currently still a big problem when you try to use the OpenAI API to access Chat-GPT. Even if you tell it not to do certain things like respond out of character or break the fourth wall, it will oftentimes just respond as an AI language model. I cannot do that. And this, of course, can break immersion if it happens within a game. At the same level, there is also the risk of use of inappropriate and offensive language. Of course, the people creating those models are already very interested in reducing this as much as possible, and this will basically need a lot of filtering of the training data and also training by using player input or people who use those models to filter out what can be used or not. And even then, there is still the whole cultural aspect. Things that are offensive to one culture might not be offensive to another, and things like this have to be considered as well. The last point I want to make is called escapism overdrive, which is basically the idea that people will lose themselves in virtual worlds in the future because AI will be so lifelike and so accessible that they might basically forget everything about the real world, forsake it, and instead decide to live in the virtual world, which could cause real problems for the real world. After all, I think we've all seen enough dystopian fiction to know where this goes. Thank you very much for your attention.
I also thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, feel free to reach out to us. We would love to collaborate and communicate with other researchers and just game enthusiasts. And
if you have any questions or ideas, always feel free to contact us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.